some extent, the Republicans kind of fell into a trap of their own design because it was them constantly, spearheaded by people like Ben Shapiro, who would have the phrase facts over feelings, facts over feelings, facts over feelings. But they're not facts over feelings. They're very much in their feelings. Everybody's in their feelings, and you have to talk to people like they're in their feelings because that's how everybody makes these decisions. Republicans pretending like they were a stranger to that, I think to some extent, you could argue, maybe led them to getting a little bit more. They gave out misinfo and couldn't bother to be transparent. Can you really blame people for being skeptical? Come on. You're not skeptical. You're not a skeptic person. You're a sheep. You just believe alternative media. I don't know why you guys throw around words like skeptical or critical. You're not skeptical or critical because you've never questioned a single thing Joe Rogan or Tim Pool has told you in your entire life. I think skepticism is good. A healthy amount of skepticism is fine, especially around public institutions, especially in times of great crisis. Skepticism would be great. If people were actually skeptical, that would be amazing. But you're not skeptical. You're not reading papers or weighing the decision between multiple people. You just turn on whatever alternative media guy you like, and then you sit there and you absorb every single thing they say at verbatim. You don't question a single thing. You're the least skeptical person in the world. Johnny boy.
We're stepping on the third rail today. We are talking about the most controversial medicine known to man, vaccines. We're very excited to have joining us Dr. Gregory Poland. He's the director of the Mayo Clinic's Vaccine Research Group.
Pleasure.
Dr. Saad Omer, director of the Yale Institute for Global Health.
Employees confront their boss over lack of raise.
Things and leave.
Are you classifying that you are firing me on the spot?
I'm firing you on the spot.
Can I get that in paper and in writing?
You can tell unemployment. I'm going to call the police in about 30 seconds. Do you want to join them, Tito? Okay, very good.
You can call the police. I'm not trespassing.
This is what happens when you ask for a raise.
Like, I'm sorry, but
You really shouldn't work for AMBS in Pleasant Valley.
the most out of all of the great people that have showed you loyalty.
Yeah, I've worked here for 7 years without a raise. What kind of boss are
I'm
you?
being paid $9.50, $8.75 to, like, what? People that have been here 7 years, man? Like, I want to show my loyalty to this place. I enjoy this job.
All right.
But the fact, the way you run this place is
You can afford me all you like, my friend.
Bro, even McDonald's has like minimum fucking raises. What the fuck? I wonder what's going on there. I feel like I'm not getting the full story here. Something is weird. Something weird is going on here.
Thank you. And Zeynep Tufekci, professor at Columbia University, columnist at the New York Times, and Pulitzer finalist for bringing clarity to the shifting official guidelines about the pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I want to start out with a disclaimer. I am a science-feeding man. I believe vaccines may be, along with antibiotics, the most miraculous invention for public health in the 20th century. But I too have questions, and I am confused. And full disclosure, I have been vaccinated, I think, it's got to be 4 times. I get a flu vaccine every year. So I am a believer. But I am also, I get fearful when I hear certain things about myocarditis, or when the sands shift beneath us between the vaccine will eradicate this disease and, well, it will lessen your symptoms. So I want to give you guys an opportunity first to just make a statement about the vaccine, this conversation, and all that. And we'll start with Dr. Poland.
Well, John, what I heard you say, I would call discerning wisdom. I think
Yes,
everything.
that's right.
I think everything you said was absolutely correct, and it was very well said. I've been a vaccinologist for 40 years.
Okay.
I would echo exactly what you said. Obviously, I'm a fervent supporter of vaccines. The data supports that it has been one of 3 things that has most prolonged the human lifespan and reduced suffering and disease and death. But we are right to have questions. We are right to be discerning. We are right to be skeptical. And communication style should reflect where we know and where we don't know. information. And I imagine that's what we'll really get into and talk about today.
That's exactly right. Dr. Omer.
Yeah, so vaccines have been some of the most effective public health interventions. That's what I do. I work on vaccines, various aspects of vaccines. But those of us who actually work closely with vaccines are, somewhat paradoxically, more respectful of people asking questions. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. Where you go with those questions, what you do with these questions is another story. In the public discourse, we have somehow evolved into having this dichotomy of pro versus anti-vaccine.
Correct.
Whereas you have a whole range of perspectives on vaccines. And in fact, we know from data for several years, at least a couple of decades, that only a small fraction of people, 2 to 3% usually in a given year, is gung-ho anti-vaccine. There's a bigger chunk of people who are the so-called fence sitters, who have questions. Some of them are answered satisfactorily, or others are not, and all of that stuff. And then there's a huge chunk of people who don't wake up every morning and think about vaccines.
I don't know that that's true, Dr. Omer. I think we all every morning I wake up and I think about vaccines. Professor Tufekci.
So I think it's almost like it's a victim of its success, right? Vaccines have completely transformed what childhood is like. If you walk by any cemetery, read any history.
Oh my God, she's quoting Batman. Victory has defeated you. Oh my God, they love Marvel too. Batman's my favorite Marvel hero.
History books, just look at anything in the pre-vaccine era. You find that so many children died. I have a friend who got polio because very unluckily his family was away the week the vaccine was given when he was a kid, and he's one of the last polio victims in Turkey because of that. So, we've lost the connection to what it was like before. But with many things that succeed, you forget that there's a lot of effort that goes into making it work. And once it succeeds, of course, we want it to be even safer and even better. It's kind of like so our standards are higher. So when vaccines first came around, people took it. They lined up their kids and cried with joy, even though the safety standards were lower, to be honest. Like at first.
But certainly trust in institutions was higher back in those days.
Well, but also we didn't know as much because.
Was trust in institutions higher? I'm trying to think. Intuitively, I want to say yes, but then I also want to, we had to have a huge debate just to get the 13 colonies to want to be in the same fucking country. But then since then, the thing I'm wondering about is was trust in institutions higher, but were there as many institutions that were as visible? I don't know. I truly have no idea. I'm pretty sure from polling data, trust in institutions have fallen over the past couple decades, but. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder what that is.
At the time, they were preventing something so horrible.
Was trust in institutions high during the Great Depression? That'd be my question, or during the Dust Bowl, or during Vietnam. I don't know.
That people kind of were it was very obvious to people that whatever risk there was, it was less than the illness. But as time passed, as we made the vaccine safer and safer and safer, and the illness got less and less and less because of the vaccines becoming so widespread, people have kind of lost this sort of balance between, yes, you have to study the trade-offs, you have to study the risks, you have to make sure it's as safe as possible. But what people have lost sight of, I think, is the other side of the equation, which is these horrific diseases that luckily people are not tested with because so many of kids and people are vaccinated. So this is what I worry about. I think there's a solution, unfortunately.
Wasn't FDR's New Deal a pretty good indicator for trust in institutions? He lifted the country out of the Depression. Yeah, I guess, but in the 60s with the Civil Rights Act, there was a lot of fighting from people against the federal government for that. I don't know. I truly don't know. I'm just asking questions. I have no idea. I really don't know.
unfortunate solution, a tragic solution, if the anti-vaxxers succeed, is that we will see horrible.
I wonder, here's another thing too. I wonder if the country was as partisan back then as well, because I bet partisanship impacts institutions as well. Because right now, there is no such thing as the FDA. There is no such thing as like the military, right? There's Biden's FDA. There's Trump's military. There's Biden's FBI. There's George W. Bush's military industrial, like it's all like owned by like, and it's very, 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 very partisan. And I'm sure that influences to some extent how people view these institutions as well. I would imagine.
Horrific outbreaks that kill so many kids in such a horrible way that it's going to be a wake-up call, and we're not going to have to argue back and forth like this because it's going to be right in front of everybody's eyes at tragic cost. And the whole reason I think we have to have these conversations and answer the questions and explain the safety and talk about the trade-offs and what we do is to make sure that the lesson doesn't happen that way, that we prevent the sort of learning by human tragedy.
Well, let me go to something Dr. Omer said, because I think this speaks to what he's talking about. You said there's probably about 2 to 3% of people that are just hardcore.
I think Jon, I disagree with Stewart over a lot of things, but I think Jon Stewart is probably what I'm going to be when I grow up. He's like, he's almost like a Bill Maher. Do you think it's fair to compare him, where he's an old school liberal, not even like a 2000s liberal or 2010s. He's like a 80s, 90s, I think, like left-leaning kind of person. I feel like Stewart's a really good litmus test for where some of your beliefs are, where like there are some things he says that piss me off, but like overall I think he's kind of got like his heart in the right place. But like if you're super ultra disagreeing with him, you're probably too far on the left or too far on the right. That'd be like my guess.
No vaccines for a variety of reasons. I mean, this has been for years now. There's been a growing movement on the far right and the far left that is very vaccine.
Stewart is hardcore on board with the leftist views on whites, though. Yeah, he might be. That's what I'm saying. He's not quite as extreme as Bill Maher, right? It's like Bill Maher, Jon Stewart, and then I don't know what other like kind of moderate left-leaning guy there'd be. I'm not sure.
Skeptical, very much about natural immunity. A lot of different issues, and we're probably not going to get into a whole lot today. But I do want to get into kind of a post-mortem, as post as you can get for a pandemic that's still going. Because for that 2 to 3% of hardcore folks who are very active on social media, can be, let's face facts, brutal on social media and threats and all kinds of other things that come their way. But the response from the powers that be, the people that have the information, really was certainty.
You and Bill Maher are 99% aligned. Yeah, Bill Maher just, it took me a little bit longer to catch up to where Bill Maher is, because I think Bill Maher started to break from like the progressives a bit quicker than I did.
And when you start out with certainty, and I'll liken it to something, and this may be the worst analogy that any of you have ever heard. The two calamities of my adult life have been 9/11 and the pandemic. Both, I feel like, had their mission accomplished moment, where they stood behind a banner and it's over, and slowly facts on the ground began to shift and sort of laid waste to that certainty and that sort of moment on.
Destiny is very much to the left of Bill Maher. No idea why he thinks otherwise. That could mean very different things depending on who you are. If you're somebody that's seen Bill Maher only shit on crazy progressives, because he does do that, and you're some Republican, you haven't watched a full Bill Maher show. Bill Maher, unless he's changed significantly, like I'm pretty sure Bill Maher would be first in line to shit on like Donald Trump. Bill Maher is not going to be sitting here championing the people that you like, unless Bill Maher has changed significantly in the past like year or two. If I haven't seen that, maybe I missed that, but.
Both. But rather than deal with it in an upfront manner, it was dealt with either with condescension or with shaming or with anybody who questioned it. There was no discerning between the 2 to 3% who would never take a vaccine and the quite large number of people who thought, this is brilliant, but wait, I have to get another one? Wait, but it doesn't handle that very... Oh, wait, but I was told this cures the, so it doesn't cure it. You can still pass it. And so all these things.
One of the ironic things here is Republicans, in a way, Stewart is right here, and this is why I focus on trying not to sound like condescending and shit all the time, because people don't respond well to it. But to some extent, the Republicans kind of fell into a trap of their own design, because it was them constantly, spearheaded by people like Ben Shapiro, who would have the phrase, facts over feelings, facts over feelings, facts over feelings. But they're not facts over feelings. They're very much in their feelings. Everybody's in their feelings, and you have to talk to people like they're in their feelings, because that's how everybody makes these decisions. Republicans pretending like they were a stranger to that, I think to some extent, you could argue, maybe led them to getting a little bit more harsh in terms of messaging than what they should have gotten, right? They should have been treated just like soft, squishy, marshmallowy progressives, because truly they are.
Things start to come up, and it becomes a victim of the very certainty of the powers that be. And these suspicions are not crazy. These are not crazy things to be nervous about. So how do we in a post-mortem have a more adult conversation with people and not just shut them down?
So that's a really good question. Just to clarify, the 2 to 3% is the usual vaccine refusal.
I see.
In COVID, what was alarming was it was a bit higher, but it was around 7 to 9%.
Okay.
Even that wasn't like 30%, 40%. There were a lot of others who had questions but were persuadable. The first thing was that pandemic has been a communications amateur hour, public health communications amateur hour. Mm-hmm. My research group was concerned because this wasn't our first rodeo in terms of even a pandemic, let alone an outbreak. We had done a lot of work during the H1N.
Oh shit, he just brought it up. I was gonna say, I feel like we've had problems. One thing that we've done, that lady brought up an interesting point about dynamic contrast. That dynamic contrast to some extent is important because if you push up all the volume, what happens is everything is just loud as fuck. All of your dB waveforms, there's a name for them, but basically they all start to look like this, and you have like these, like everything is like fucking loud, and instead of having, you know, like your louder sounds or whatever, like everything just gets like super fucking blown out. There has to be room to say like, this is a bad thing, this is kind of bad, this is pretty bad, this is catastrophic. But it feels like something we've done with all of our politics is nothing is like bad or kind of bad and catastrophic anymore. Everything is a catastrophe. Everything is the end of the world. Everything is completely fucked and it's over. And I'm gonna be honest, like even I like didn't care about anything relating to like health stuff for like H1. Like when the COVID stuff started getting talked about, I went into like H1N1 mode. Like that bird flu was gonna be the end of human civilization. And I didn't think it was like a bad flu season. I mean like 60,000 people died, right? Like, okay. Like, and I heard so much about like the bird flu. And also, and I just lived through one here now in Miami, now that I've been here for a year, like these hurricanes that are supposed to be the end of civilization in Florida, that last hurricane, I'm pretty sure I was told over and over again, I think people in chat were making fun of me for staying home, like, oh, you're gonna die, it's gonna be horrible, and it didn't even hit Miami. It's just, like we got like a little bit of rain for a day, and that's happened over and over again. Even Shepard Smith on Fox News, I remember him watching videos of people outside, and he's like, yeah, they're gonna die, they're gonna die, they're gonna die, they're gonna die, they are going to die. And I was like, damn. And when everything sounds like a catastrophe, nothing is a catastrophe. Yeah, so that's something you always have to be cognizant of when you're doing communications.
One pandemic, that we had concerns enough to ask the question, what will be the vaccine acceptance? So early May 2020, we did a national survey to gauge vaccine acceptance of the forthcoming vaccine. And we found was that only 67% of the people would accept the vaccine right away. There was a small fraction.
This is in the early stages of the pandemic when it was really raging.
It was raging, and we projected it to a few months. Nobody had the exact date available because, as you remember, everyone was projecting a little bit later. So we presented these scenarios. There are systematic ways of gauging people's attitudes, and we found that not only that, it was 67%. But
people are saying, LeMayo, people's houses got completely flooded in that hurricane, just chancing to hit Miami. You can pretend that it was just the only one, but like this has happened over and over again. I remember there was a past one with my parents where I think I was even encouraging them, oh, you guys got to get out. And they're like, oh, no, we'll be fine. It'll be okay. I'm pretty sure there have been at least 2 or 3 hurricanes like that in the past like 5 to 10 years that were supposed to be like utter catastrophes that were going to like fucking like people like this. And it was just like, they came and some were pretty bad in some areas, but it was nowhere near the catastrophe that people were pretending they were going to be. That's not good.
Also, there were four factors. We created a so-called statistically predictive model of vaccine acceptance. One was region, the other one was education, age, and then race. And all of these things turned out to be prescient. That's the magic of measuring things in advance. And a lot of us were jumping up and down saying that, look,
the reason it's a big deal is because we don't know where it will hit exactly. So everyone should prepare because it might hit you. Yeah, sure. But like if you don't message like that, then people aren't going to listen when that message actually needs to be heard, right? That's the problem.
Coming up with this technology, which is wonderful. So I do vaccine trials as well. I do the other side of vaccines as well. And I was really excited about it. But we need to absolutely pay attention to these human factors. And
after Katrina, can you blame them? Maybe. I don't even know if Katrina was that bad of a hurricane. I'm not actually sure. I'd have to go back and look it up. I thought that the things that made Katrina horrible was the water management and the sea level that the sea level that everybody was sitting on. I thought that's what made Katrina horrible. It wasn't that it was an unbelievably horribly destructive hurricane. It was that the city just wasn't built at all to be able to. Hold on one second. Oh, no, remember. Why is my bot so broken today?
I said that on, I don't know, I think Dr. Poland was on these calls with the Operation Warp Speed. A lot of us spoke up on these calls.
Right. But wasn't that the first mistake? Why would you name something that is, that people are hesitant about, warp speed? Doesn't that why don't you just name it going as fast as we can and not paying attention to what might happen?
It was an unfortunate name, I think, and gave the illusion that corners were being cut and things like that. But to your point, John, I really do think that these are discussions that should be approached with, if you will, scientific and intellectual humility. We don't know.
Humility. What a perfect word to describe what didn't happen.
In fact, I will tell you, in my 4-decade-long career as a vaccinologist, I describe this as a matrix. There are so many factors changing so quickly over time that we need to admit, in many ways, we're building the airplane while we're flying it.
Right.
People are doing the best they can, but the distortion of the pandemic by human behavior has made this much more difficult. But that implies a burden on us as public health officials, as physician scientists, to give some voice to those uncertainties, to the humility that we should have in describing this to a public that is rightly skeptical.
So let me jump in as the social scientist here. I always joke that, I'm a doctor too, technically, but I always joke, like in an emergency, I can do an emergency review. If they ever call for a doctor, I can review the literature really fast.
Very important.
But in this particular case, it actually turned out to be very important. From the beginning, sort of social scientific understanding of how people behave, why they behave, how authorities behave, was put to the side. And this is a major problem, I have to say, with public health. And with all due respect to the two actual useful doctors on the panel with us, it is a problem with the field of medicine as well. There is a lot of not trusting the public not leveling with the public, not talking about the uncertainty, and just trust us attitude that is very common among public health practitioners in places of power, that is very common among medical doctors as well. I'm not saying all of them. I have some of my best friends are medical doctors, once again.
Certainly not Dr. Omer, Dr. Poland. They're beyond reproach. Why would we even be thinking of that?
No, of course not. But so this is the thing is that, so it is of course very understandable to say what the heck is going on. In fact, I ended up writing a piece for the New York Times on the unvaccinated because I was so upset that they were being portrayed solely as the crazies that you could easily find on Twitter spouting nonsense. And I was like, where is the research? Who are these people? What's going on? And when I dug in as a social scientist and looked at what research was available, what I found was a small number of people who were genuinely irrational and just had decided this was their culture war. But for most people, they were confused. In this country, we don't have great health insurance, and a lot of people do not have.
I think this is something that I've said over and over and over and over and over again, that the thing that sucks about all of you retards that follow these losers like Russell Brand and Joe Rogan and Brett Weinstein when they talk about vaccines was that there were really good conversations that could have been had and should have been had and still need to be had about vaccines and their side effects and whether the risk is worth it for certain age groups. Do young boys need to get it, or is the risk higher than the reward? Like, there are good conversations that needed to happen, but like they can't in the environment where everybody is insane about their takes on things. And it sucks because you do yourself a disservice by acting like such an unhinged lunatic about them, which is irritating. But can you name one thing Joe Rogan said was true that wasn't? His quasi-endorsement of alternative medical treatments that none of you guys, by the way, talk about anymore, like hydroxychloroquine, like ivermectin, the simping over certain FDA emergency use treatments and not others, like, for instance, supporting monoclonal antibodies that were highly experimental. I'm not even sure if those are still in use anymore, versus the vaccine, bringing on charlatans like that Dr. Robert Malone guy that largely don't know what they're talking about or are spreading pseudoscientific conspiracy theories and are like universally panned in their field. Almost everything Joe Rogan contributed to the vaccine conversation or the COVID-19 conversation was horseshit. I don't know if the monoclonal antibodies are used anywhere. They might be. I think they worked. I think there was good evidence for them working, but they were really, really, really expensive. Like, it was like, wasn't it like $5,000 per infusion? And I don't know if insurance covered them, I think.
Have a regular doctor. They do not have regular access, and the uninsured were most likely to be unvaccinated. They didn't have somebody to.
That supposed inventor of mRNA vaccines on Joe Rogan early on was a major issue. That's the Dr. Robert Malone guy. Yeah, that guy spread so much pseudoscientific nonsense. He's not the inventor of mRNA vaccines. He published one paper related to the early point of the technology early on when he was I think he was an undergrad or master's student. Like, yeah. Just so much of that bullshit.
I found a lot of people who were confused. They were afraid of COVID. They were afraid of the vaccine. They didn't know who to ask. They saw the shifting guidance that wasn't properly explained. And we saw this again and again on things like masks, on things like infection-based immunity, on things like myocarditis risk. We did not get, look, here's the best of our knowledge. Here's what we changed. Here's what we got. We got this sort of very certain speak that then shifted and then shifted again.
And then pretended it didn't shift.
Because I have a son, I looked it up. I had to make the decision, Moderna versus Pfizer, all those things. There's a lot of nuance that hasn't been communicated.
Here's an example. So the highest risk for myocarditis, Zainab, as you're pointing out, is men in the 16 to 17-year-old age. If we give a million doses.
My son.
Yeah. If we give a million doses of an.
If we give 1 million doses, was the rate 7 to 10 out of 100,000? If we give 1 million doses, are we expecting, I think, is it about 100 adverse events? I think that's my guess. Around there?
mRNA vaccine. We prevent 57,000 cases of COVID-19, 500 COVID-related hospitalizations, and 170 COVID-related intensive care unit admissions. The price we pay is 73 cases of vaccine-associated myocarditis.
So I said about 100, so even less than that, yeah. The rate was 7 out of 100,000, so the myocarditis out of a million would be about 70.
Now, most of those are benign. In fact, if we hospitalize them more often than not to assuage our own fear. There's a rare one that can be more significant, but it is that teeter-totter I was talking about. And you know what it ends up being is your own psychological predisposition. Is it the sin of omission or the sin of commission? I have literally walked out of the consulting room with one mother saying, if something happened to little Johnny because I gave him this vaccine, I could never forgive myself. I go into the next room and the mom says, how could I not give little Ashley this vaccine? If she got COVID and something happened, I could never forgive myself. And there's the nuance that we've been talking about. We have not equipped the public, even the public health authorities who are discussing this, with that kind or that level of communication.
And detail, but the real lesson there is apparently parents cannot forgive themselves.
Yeah.
No matter
John,
what they do.
here's
no
another
matter
thing.
which
In
choice.
other countries, they also talk about how to lower the risk. So we have great research from Canada and a couple other countries that if you space it to at least 2 months, so between the first vaccine to like 2 to 3 months, and also use Pfizer, which is lower dose than Moderna. So in a lot of other countries, they said there's a tiny little risk, but to avoid it, you should space the vaccine, and men under 40 should get Pfizer rather than Moderna, right? That is straightforward, scientific. That's what other sane countries did.
Right.
And that's like, as a mother of a son, I did the same research. I'm like, why aren't they telling us?
Never been communicated.
I hate saying this because I want the CDC to succeed. I want them to be much better. But I'll give you a non-vaccine example, is that for the longest time, the U.S. wouldn't approve rapid tests for clinical, non-clinical, like home purposes, because the FDA argued people would do wrong things with it. Like what? Like test themselves? What?
Swab the ear. You do the ear.
They would be like, they can't interpret it unless a doctor is
That's
involved.
right.
I was like, are you kidding me? And then, because like, of course people can, you explain to them, here's the false positive, here's what it means,
Right.
here's what you do, and let people empower people. And finally, when we approved them, it became gung-ho and we're going to give everybody lots of rapid tests, and great. And then when Omicron hit, when there was a shortage, CDC started saying, we're not really sure we can trust rapid tests for like ending isolation. I'm like, how convenient.
Right.
Just when we have a shortage, you change your mind again. Like, as a person who loves these institutions,
And wants them to do better.
this was the most painful thing to watch over and over. And again, very, very much respect to the clinicians that are at the front lines, the 2 medical doctors here. The whole, the tragedy of the long COVID patients who are still left behind and denied very often by their own doctors. There's a lot of these things where patients are not treated as partners. And then it fuels the worst people who use these weaknesses not to try to make the soul better the way I want to. They use it to fuel their grift, their ideology, their nonsense, which is going to get people killed.
Dr. Poland, you want to jump in? Dr.
Yeah.
Poland's been waiting patiently. Yes, sir.
Zainab, I would endorse what you're saying, and it extends beyond that. My daughter is a mental health and trauma specialist. She and I have written a few papers on this last summer in the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine, and we talked about the distortion of pandemics by human behavior, whether we're talking about institutional behavior, public health officials, the medical authorities, whoever it may be. Ironically, right before the pandemic started, and I have sat and been a participant in many tabletop exercises. We did an international tabletop exercise in Washington, D.C. The one area that we can't get focus on is on the whole anthropology, sociology, and psychology around pandemics.
Well, about healthcare in general.
Yes, and that is what distorted this.
Dr. Omer.
Yeah, so if I may build on Professor Tafiqchi's point, it's absolutely correct. that the face of the medical establishment and the face of public health establishment was not communicating. The folks that were presenting the face of these entities were not communicating effectively. But I would add a little bit of nuance. Look, these are individual people, and what happened during the pandemic was a lot of people within these organizations and outside these organizations without actual experience on communicating, on without the background and training that.
Thoughts on her comments? Sometimes it feels like I'm fighting an uphill battle just because of the poor communication from the CDC. Yeah, a little bit, yeah. The problem is that they have to be like sharper than normal because there are so many bad faith actors in the field. Like, I don't think there was that much confusion from the CDC. But the problem is if you're consuming alternative media, especially conservative media, relating to vaccines, and then there's anything that's not 1,000,000% clear from the CDC, then you're going to get mind fucked because everybody else is like telling you insane shit in the meantime. So they had to be like more diligent than ever in fighting off like their own misinformation. In being even slightly wrong on anything. That's like there are still people in my chat, I bet, that have on their copy and paste that one time Biden said, if you get the vaccine, you won't spread the disease. And they're like, they told us it was a 100% safe. It was 100% going to stop it. It was 100%. Like, there are still people that do that. So when you're in that type of environment where there's a bunch of like rabid 65 IQ hyenas, like waiting to jump on any single fucking possible little miscommunication, you have to be incredibly, what's the word I'm looking for? Where you are ardently looking at your communication to make sure it's good. You have to be very, not persistent, not virulent. You have to be incredibly, there's a good word I'm looking for. What's it called? Diligent? Vigilant. Yeah, that was what I was saying. You'd be very vigilant. You have to be hyper vigilant when it comes to your communication and messaging. Destiny, am I misremembering that there were a couple of times that Fauci and CDC were saying completely different things? There were a couple of times where a few messages might have diverged a little bit, but if you were approaching everything in good faith, like everything was like pretty understandable for the entirety of the pandemic. The only problem is when conservatives were playing hyper-partisan politics in between everything. That was the issue. And then any little massive thing got blown the out of.
Was relevant to a public health response were not the face of the pandemic. I'll give you an example. I would not have imagined that Ann Schuchat, for example, deputy director for the CDC, one of the most experienced folks during the pandemic that was available to the CDC, Nancy Messonnier, the person who sounded the alarm earlier on. These people have been involved with anthrax response, with Ebola response, with H1N1 response.
Hold on. You don't get to use that word. Hold on. Destiny, they gave out misinfo and couldn't bother to be transparent. Can you really blame people for being skeptical? Come on. You're not skeptical. You're not a skeptic person. You're a sheep. You just believe alternative media. I don't know why you guys throw around words like skeptical or critical. You're not skeptical or critical because you've never questioned a single thing Joe Rogan or Tim Pool has told you in your entire life. That would be skeptical. I think skepticism is good. A healthy amount of skepticism is fine, especially around public institutions, especially in times of great crisis. Skepticism would be great. If people were actually skeptical, that would be amazing. But you're not skeptical. You're not reading papers or weighing the decision between multiple people. You just turn on whatever alternative media guy you like, and then you sit there and you absorb every single thing they say at verbatim. You don't question a single thing. You're the least skeptical person in the world.
None of them were utilized to their full extent by the establishment. So they weren't the face of the pandemic response. So that's what I talk about, like very sincere inclusion of expertise that was, a lot of it wasn't relevant and not taking advantage of the experience we had within the government.
Agreed. Let me proffer two things, because I think it's, and again, we may be over intellectualizing something where there are certain obvious things that kind of stare us in the face. One is the face of the pandemic and many of the people that came about. And this is something that we see in every industry, and perhaps the medical community needs to rethink that sort of revolving door. But it may seem like, well, that's just how business is done, and wouldn't they want the expertise on their boards, and those boards pay those things? But that kind of conflict of interest fuels mistrust. It does in every industry. I find the same problem on Wall Street when you have an SEC revolving door. Moderna, Pfizer, J&J, these are enormous companies making enormous profits. Now, I'm not suggesting that they exploited a crisis or created a crisis, but these are reasonable concerns for people, that there are conflicts of interest between profit and public health.
I was just like tweeting about that today because Scott Gottlieb, I think that's a good example because he's the ex-head of FDA, he's head of Trump's FDA, and he's on the Pfizer board. So when the whole thing started and when I started seeing him, I couldn't have been more wary of the guy. Like he's on the, I think an AEI fellow, like as ideologically out there from me as possible. On the other hand, while I completely acknowledge that this is a major conflict for him to be speaking up, I listened to him throughout like almost 3 years now. And he went on business press, he went on conservative media, and he actually ended up making a lot of sensible points that I thought were informative, balanced. He was very wary of vaccine mandates. He was one of the first people to point out that natural immunity was a thing and it worked, but vaccination was safer. So I found his message correct and actually useful because he could reach people I probably could not. On the other hand, I kept thinking, why is it him? Why isn't there anybody else on
Couldn't
that
there be
side
somebody
of the
who isn't on the board of the company that made the vaccines?
I completely,
Right.
And here's the problem. There wasn't. That side of the political spectrum did not produce people who weren't on the board of Pfizer.
It's not just that side of the political spectrum. I mean, the left side of the political spectrum is
That's
also
a different
involved.
picture. So what I'm saying is, I think he stepped up at a great risk to himself. So created the problem you talk about, but on the other hand, points to the fact that where are the people who don't have these conflicts,
That's
who
right.
could step up and not have us be discussing something like this?
So I'll give, that's a really good point, and actually I think the response might be illustrative. Two things, but I'll go back to your bigger point, John, which is, is this a rational thing to talk about? It is, absolutely. And the answer to that is, look, we do derive some value as a society for some people to be engaged with vaccine companies so that our science remains credible, it has quality,
Is this a new video?
And sort of all sorts of robustness.
Yeah, it was
Having
uploaded
said
11 days
that,
ago.
as a society, as a community of scientists, there should be a significant fraction of us who don't have that perceived or real conflict of interest. I have chosen to be that person. I don't take any money from vaccine companies. I don't have not even grants to my institution, etc. I do my own work. I pay for my own meals in scientific meetings.
Dr. Omer, how dare they?
No,
you pay
exactly.
for your. You know what? When I see you, you and me are getting a little grilled cheese sandwich, something. I'm gonna get you a little something, little nosh.
No, but the thing is, even the small stuff, and it's not that I see that there's an inherent ethical flaw with people interacting with vaccine companies. I do believe, on the other hand, as part of the overall ecosystem, you should have a significant proportion of people who, if Scott Gottlieb, who's serving on the board of Pfizer, is saying the same thing, which passes that sort of scientific litmus test, that those of us who are not engaged with Pfizer or any other company are saying the same thing, so that the overall credibility is somewhat maintained. What we need to do is to better explicate, better communicate what is a conflict of interest, and the fact that there are a lot of us who don't do that. Coming back to the other point, so what were these people doing? Well, these people were actually working, doing the trials. So if you have the bandwidth, there's a very small overlap in that Venn diagram where you were. So I was on several the World Health Organization committees that required that, because of their meetings were globally timed, I was waking up on a given morning for the first 6-7 months at 5:30 a.m. prepping for the stuff. These were vaccine safety data evaluation committees, so we were getting the data almost live. This was vaccine recommendation committee. I was doing my own research, vaccine effectiveness research, vaccine acceptance research. So all of that is out there in published literature. So there is that nuance. So because of that vacuum, that if I had to prioritize between tweeting out my own
Have we been to Helsinki? What? That's Finland, no? Oh, cringe. Somebody asked. I was going to.
Paper and doing the next paper, I know I made that choice.
Well, let me jump on the word nuance, and I'll address this to Dr. Poland, because I think, boy, nuance is a word that within any conversation in the 21st century is something that's generally missing, and
Good one.
And maybe science in particular suffers from that that feeling of certainty. And I think what science likes to project is certainty. And I think it's important to draw a distinction between mathematics and science. 1 + 1 is 2, but science is really about probabilities. It's really about this vaccine will give you a higher probability of survival than, let's say, just allowing COVID to take its course. This drug will give you high, but nothing is certain. And I think maybe the myopia that afflicts that industry is the projection of certainty and the dismissing of nuance. So it in some ways, aren't we talking about a problem within the industry as a whole in not talking about things as probabilities?
Yeah.
But you're like looking at the wrong. I'm sorry. Let Dr. Poland go and
Dr. Poland,
yeah.
and then you can correct me, Professor. No. I will get a B+ on this. Trust me.
Well,
I am teachable.
We're not certain. There's a probability, but part of the problem is, as you point out, communication and cognitive styles. So physicians and scientists are professionalized in one style, what cognitively would be called an analytic style, okay? Mm-hmm. What the population is, if you will, professionalized, is with heuristics, rules of thumb for how they make decisions. Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for kind of teasing apart how people think and the cognitive biases that they bring to this. Mm-hmm. When you think about it, people get vaccines for one of only a few reasons. Because they're forced to, because they're bribed to do it, bandwagoning, that is peer pressure, and fear. Those are the only 4 known reasons for why people get vaccines. What we tend not to do in the medical and scientific profession, and this is where I would argue we need cultural anthropologists, we need sociologists, we need psychologists, linguists at the table, and they are not. We need them at the table to bring that nuance, because we don't even recognize the cognitive bias that we're using to communicate with. You're right. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I tried to summarize it very simply, I would say vaccines save lives, they prevent disease, they prevent disability. Do they have side effects? Yes, but wisdom resides in the balance of those risks and benefits. And in this case, it's decidedly tipped toward vaccines. However, because there are probabilities of side effects, and this is where the art of medicine...
You suffered one, Doctor.
I did.
Didn't you? Right.
I absolutely did. I developed tinnitus, or ringing in my ear, after my second dose, worsened after my booster. And we're still trying to work with CDC and others to focus on, is this a significant side effect from it? But, the point being that you make a decision based on those nuances. And so when you present nuance as certainty, well, common experience is going to mitigate against that. And what you've now done is bred mistrust and skepticism.
That's right. And that breeding mistrust leads to that moment now where a young man is struck down on a football field. And as I'm trying to search Twitter for results on his condition, all I'm getting is died suddenly, young men all collapsing, all throughout the world, tens of thousands of people. I mean, and I don't know what to make of any of it.
This came up when Grant Wall died.
Same thing.
And yet with empathy to his spouse, who is one of us, an infectious disease doctor. She insisted on an autopsy, and recently that autopsy showed he died of a ruptured aortic aneurysm.
But she made a great point, which is these discussions must take place
Yes.
with empathy and with data
Absolutely.
and with facts, because I've got to tell you, again, a science-fearing man who's had the vaccines, I'm in that demographic where they told us, you're the people we should keep in the basement and don't do anything for 2 years. But when I see these stories, even for me, there is a part of myself that has a moment of doubt. And Professor, these are the kinds of things, we keep talking about how people actually behave and how people actually think. Look, there are people that lost their jobs because they wouldn't get the vaccine. And we don't, some of them might have been trolls and crazies and things, but some of them might have been reasonably mistrustful of something in their family backgrounds or their lives that caused them to make that decision, and they paid a pretty stiff penalty for it.
Well, and this is really important in our society. I mean, it becomes what epistemological lens are you going to look through in order to make decisions? Once we reject the scientific method, we're in a world of hurt. But that scientific method needs to be transparent. It needs to be radically honest. It needs to be communicated with all the humility and nuance. And we need to hear people's stories and their journey and respond to that, not in some sort of...
Why are you not using the carbon fiber conveyor belts? Are you about to get permabanned? There is no carbon fiber conveyor belts.
Reflexive, scientific way as much as we do in an empathetic way.
Right. Professor.
So I'm going to put on my sociologist hat because I'm, again, and I'm going to slightly disagree. I don't think anybody's making that kind of individual decisions really because I know. Because see, this is the thing. This is what people don't understand about scientists. There's no people that love arguing more. Like if you don't like arguing in doubt, it's the wrong profession for you. So that's why this is what we do. We argue most with the people we love.
Peer review.
That said, when you get up, go to the airport, and line up to get in an aluminum tin whatever can.
That's probably meant deep space belts. Yeah, deep space belts are more science. Do you think that guy meant deep space belts? You survived today.
In the sky.
That's right.
At like that kind of speed, at 30,000 feet, you are not doing your own research. You are not considering this and that. You're not using the scientific method. You are trusting the institutions, and because the institutions have delivered. It's not like airplane flying was always safe. They're like planes, but after there's an accident, there is transparency, there is accountability, there's research, there's experience. You keep getting on the plane and it keeps ending up. I mean, it's otherwise an insane thing to do. Like we just sit there and you put 100 chimps there and there'd be no limbs left by the end of that thing. We're a very sort of passive social
By the way, 100 chimps is actually Southwest's new motto.
So there you go. But so the thing is, when you go to the supermarket and you buy salad or chicken or something,
that's right.
And when you don't go to your own basement and try to understand, does this have E. coli? You don't have an expertise in bacteriology. You are not really using the scientific method because you cannot. Even though I'm a great fan of vaccines, when somebody injects me with that vaccine, I haven't tested what's in it. I haven't checked if they screwed up the dose. I haven't checked if it's the right dial.
That's
I
right.
am putting my trust in institutions that I'm expecting to function in a particular way. I'm expecting them to work on my behalf. I'm expecting them to be transparent. I'm not expecting them to be perfect, but I want them to be trying. This is why the conflicts of interest are important. This is why the revolving doors are important. This is why, right now the FDA, FAA, the SEC, all of our institutions have been captured, defanged, corrupted, EPA including, like there's a lot of good people there. There's an enormous number of people who are trying to do their best, but they keep getting out-lobbied, industry revolving doors. You see this in the tech industry. Half the Obama White House went to the tech industry, and like they go back and forth. This is how do you get good tech regulation in that kind of environment. So there's a way in which our institutions are failing us. I don't think it is fair to expect any single person to quote unquote do their own research and read all these scientific papers and try to, because you will be confused. There's a reason why Dr. Ömer and Dr. Poland are reading and writing those papers, because it took years and years of training. It took a lot of understanding. I see this all the time on Twitter. Somebody will have a screenshot from a paper and will say, look, they found this, and that sentence does say that, but there's like 30 paragraphs before it, putting it in context.
No context.
Right. It doesn't say that. So the thing is, what we need, and this is what I think so important I think there's like this sort of, what's the right word, mirage, that we can empower individuals to navigate this. And I'm convinced that you cannot empower individuals one by one. What you need is functioning institutions that, yes, communicate properly, do their best, empower people.
Individuals can be, though, a powerful check on institutions.
Yeah.
Correct, and they are partners in this.
You need that as part of the ecosystem that helps cleanse it. And I'm talking about being able to discern between those who are bad faith actors. And believe me, in the vaccine debate, there are a lot of bad faith actors, but there are also people who are genuinely concerned. And
the lady's 100% dead, though. That's a lot of blood. I can't tell if that's blood from the lady or if that's like leaking something from the car because of the color of it on the ground.
Fortunately, when these institutions struggle, the real victims, not just the public, but the rank and file in those industries, the nurses and the doctors who are on the front lines and who are dealing with, in clinical settings, that mistrust or that hostility or that anger, while putting themselves at great personal risk on the front lines of a pandemic that we still don't quite understand. And now that we've gone into sort of quadratic equation variants, as it moves along, I still don't know, when we talk about polio and we talk about smallpox, there was an eradication to it, and that became our expectation. And this follows much more of maybe a flu model than it does with an eradication, but that certainly was not the expectation in the beginning of this. And it's been difficult for them to communicate the ephemeral nature of these different variants and the different things that went. And I agree with you guys. I think there needs to be almost a peer review about that linkage between the institutions of science and the public that they serve.
Well, you're really
also what are we going to settle out at our yearly death rates for COVID? It kind of sucks if we just have something that's endemic now that's killing like 100 to 200,000 people a year. How many U.S. citizens died COVID 2022? 267,000 people. Is that like the norm now? We just have a disease that kills like 250,000 people every year? That kind of sucks. It sucks too, because now, like, if any, like some years are going to be better than others, some years are going to be worse than others, right? So, like, some years 1 million people die, some years 100,000 people die. Like, that kind of sucks. So check the regular flu death rate. Flu death rate is like, I think it's like 12 to 30 or 12 to 40,000 a year on average.
Arguing for this idea of trust in institutions.
And how do you build it?
And let me just give you one example. The vaccination rate for COVID in Denmark is among the highest in the world.
Oh, they love their vaccinations.
And there's a reason for that. They trust
60 to 70K? No. 60K is like huge flu, horrible season. 60K is on the high end. I think it's like 10 to 50K is like the average, and 50 is like very, very high. I think it's like 10 to like 30 or 10 to 40, I think it is.
Their government. They trust their public health officials.
Trust has to be earned, though.
It has to be earned.
Yes,
it has to be
absolutely.
earned. No question about it.
And Denmark was one of the first countries to be able to drop a lot of mitigation measures.
Right.
They did. So they were the first to be able to get over the worst part of the pandemic, because
Right.
all the things other people complain about, the lockdowns, the masks, the this and that, Denmark showed how you can get out of it as quickly as possible when you have functioning institutions.
What they did
Right.
is they said, okay, we think it's safe to take masks off now. And then when it surged, they said, okay, put your masks back on. And the population trusted them and did it. And they navigated the pandemic really very well.
Dr. Omer.
Coming back to trust. So a lot of my research group is now focusing on how do you develop the science around trust, and it's work in progress. Stay tuned. But what we know so far, in terms of public health institutions specifically, there are three dimensions of trust. One is perceived empathy. So the entity has my interest at heart. The other part is perceived lack of conflict of interest. So these are overlapping but slightly different things, but we already discussed that. The third thing is perceived competence. And as much as I love my colleague at the CDC, we had falling down of actual competence, not in the area of vaccine safety. I've been paying attention. This is what I do for a living. Vaccine safety was delayed. So the problem there was the systems were so sclerotic, and the fact that they have this kind of what they call scientific review, internal review, which I think Dr. Poland has also suffered through that. When if you have even one CDC author, it goes through this black hole of review, which doesn't add to the science. Because of that, there was a delay in the safety science come out. But there were a lot of other scientific.
Were the cloth masks that people wore effective at all? I don't know if there was ever a study on just masks, but I'm pretty sure it came out that wearing any facial covering is going to be quite a bit more effective than nothing. I'm pretty sure that's what it ended up being.
Shortcomings, like not paying attention to genomic surveillance, like what Professor Tofikci alluded to.
Destiny, why do we care about what these people say? I want to see Malone and Fauci sit down, not employee. Why would I care about what Malone would have to say? If Fauci wanted to sit down with somebody qualified to speak, sure, but the Malone guy has nothing, has no reason to talk about any of this shit. I don't know how long he's been out of research, 40 years or whatever relating to this. Dr. Malone sitting down with anybody would never be an interesting conversation. Maybe if there are, I'm trying to think if there's what qualified person represents the vaccine skeptic side enough. I'm not sure. I would have to think about it. I truly don't know. I'd have to think about it.
The fact about ending isolation after 5 days without testing or sort of broader isolation guidance, not relying on rapid tests.
Let's stand 6 feet away from each other, but only for 15 minutes, and only if you're in a laboratory. But if you walk outside, then you got to put a hood over your head, but then you got to wait. I mean, it really got crazy.
This goes back even further than that. I mean, very early on in the pandemic, I published an editorial. My colleagues panned it. It got published. And I called it the tortoise and the hare, and I predicted at that point this S-only approach to vaccines was doomed to fail. And that's exactly what's happened. And what it uncovered was the relative lack of understanding. I've studied RNA respiratory viruses for 40 years.
Beautiful.
And it made you realize that there was not a deep understanding of the hypermutability of this virus, and this virus was going to change very rapidly. So unilateral.
Please react to Dr. John Campbell. We already watched some of his videos yesterday. That's another dude who's his brain got shut down over COVID. There's a lot of people that went crazy in 2021, 2022. A lot of people that lost their minds, and unfortunately, he was one of the victims. Because at the start, he was a really, really, really cool dude, a really effective communicator, and then he just is a full conspiracy brain dude now. That's all he does.
One-sided, we're going to deal with this variant, was doomed to fail. The result of this, absent some really important advances in vaccinology, absent those, your great-great-great-grandchildren are going to be getting vaccines against coronavirus. That's the ultimate implication of all this.
So to build on that, one of the things that we have fallen short is that it was supposed to be a relay. And we, after one or two legs, we gave up on the development program in all its force.
There was no more funding.
there was
Yeah.
no more funding and no more sort of serious effort to develop the next generation of vaccines. For example, the pan-coronavirus vaccine. So the government is still investing in this.
But to be fair, you're also, again, none of this is occurring in a vacuum. So you're also up against a society that is suffering in isolation. And that is ultimately that mission accomplished problem. You've got school kids that are home. You've got people that can't go out. And so everybody's rushing to have that moment on a battleship with a big sign, rather than explaining that for all our human progress, this prehistoric, microscopic being, this virus, can still have its way with a population and still, cause us great pain. And it seems like, and we can talk about the state of play right now, which is, rather than losing 1 million people a year, we've sort of settled into this acceptance of 1,000 deaths a week. And
that metaverse B guy, I can't tell if he's a legitimate conservative or if he's just a troll, because he spouts off every single conspiracy theory that conservatives talk about when it comes to vaccines. But he might just be a conservative who just knows all the theories. But yeah, none of the RNA vaccines don't modify your DNA at all. They don't have the capability of doing so.
that's where we're at.
Well, let's be fair though. This is okay. Here's the thing. I take what you're saying, and coronaviruses, like the other 4 human coronaviruses, also reinfect, quite often. We had a pandemic, and within 9 months of its sort of official start, we had vaccines that were and still are incredible at severity, death, hospitalization across the board. And if you look at the current things, if you get the updated vaccine recently, even for like rates of death and hospitalization, even among the most frail and elderly, are very, very low. Most of our deaths is because we have not taken up the booster. If you look at countries like Singapore, other countries that track this really well, they also have the Omicron, they also have the mutated one, but their death rates, their hospitalization rates are very, very low. So it's not that the vaccine it could be better. I would love a pan-coronavirus vaccine, but the one we have, if we used it, would have gotten us so much better out of this. And on top of this, there's the question of long COVID, which for a minority of people is very debilitating. And those people, and
terrible.
This is what I want.
Is that true? The boosters really that effective? Yes. The boosters are incredibly effective at Here's the problem. The boosters are incredibly effective at preventing hospitalization, but not that many people get hospitalized from COVID. So if 100 out of 10,000 people get hospitalized, if they were vaccinated, maybe it would only be 30 out of 100 people. But like it's so few that you don't see those 20 that are being saved out of 10,000 or whatever, right? Yeah.
Want to say you need to get there like the firefighters after 9/11. The long COVID patients
Really?
are the firefighters of this pandemic. They're being left behind.
Really?
Everybody wants to, yes.
Left behind
Everybody-
in a sense that medical science is not looking into it, or in what way?
It's not looking into it anywhere near enough. There's not new funding in the new bill. These people are very sick.
How prevalent is this?
Somewhere around 10 to 20% of people who
What?
develop COVID have a complication or a long COVID. It's a significant number.
Yeah, but the severe one is lower than that.
Yes, the severe one that we're talking about is
Okay.
much lower, because if it was 10 to 20%, you'd say it. If you look at the United Kingdom, which calculates this really well because we don't have good epidemiology in the US, they find about 0.5% of the population is severely affected. That's like a couple of million people, perhaps, like 0.5%.
Wow.
And these people have been sick for more than a year, most of them. Most of it is pre-vaccine. You have the occasional post-vaccine, but that's rarer. And even though Congress allocated $1 billion to it like 2 years ago, the very first trial from that billion, 2023, is starting now.
Right.
There's no new money for it. And these people are so sick, so severely sick, that they can't protest.
Do you think this is because we're still kind of fighting on, that we haven't opened up that second front?
No, we want to move on. We want to move on. Look, after 1918, we got the Roaring 20s. People, like after 9/11, people want to move on and get on with their lives. And there's a small but substantial number of people who are very sick, who are the true casualties of this pandemic after the people who died, and that we want to move away from.
Well, the issue, I don't think it's quite as simple as what you're saying. The issue tends to be one more systemic in medicine. Look, there were post-infection syndromes after influenza, after Lyme disease, after a variety of infections. What tends to happen in medicine is that entities we don't understand tend to get ignored. So what we need to address this issue, and it will have implications beneficial across medicine, is the right funding for things like this. It really is difficult to begin to categorize, to develop biomarkers, to understand syndromes. We talk about long COVID as if it's one thing. It's not. That's a wastebasket diagnosis. It's multiple things, different, what we would call clinical phenotypes. Some people have neurologic predominant long COVID, other people cardiac, other people psychologic and psychiatric. Diabetes, difficulty with thinking and brain fog. So there are different kinds of quote, long COVID, probably related to severity of disease and to genetic predisposition and other issues, even what variant they might have gotten infected with. So you need for academic investigators to get interested in this, they need funding to carry out these studies.
100% agree with this, by the way. We're not disagreeing at all. I totally agree with what you said,
Let me make a suggestion to that then, because, in a lot of ways, and listen, there's not a lot of transparency in this at all, but there's a lot of mistrust over kind of virus research, right? And DARPA and the various things that are going along. Perhaps if we were to look at long COVID as a national security effect and get some of that sweet $850 billion of funding that goes to the Defense Department, which goes towards weaponizing all sorts of varieties of things, we could make some real headway on this. And maybe that's the shift that has to take place, is that it's not just altruistic doctors in their spare time at 5:30 in the morning faxing things. It's the United States government recognizing long COVID and these issues as a national security
And John,
problem.
I would agree, it is a national security issue.
I don't like the national security interest everything, because everything is a national security interest. Our steel production is a national security interest. Our border is a national security interest. Our health is everything is technically a national security interest. Right?
In this regard, it is an economic issue. And
Of
it's
course.
an economic issue among our most, if you will, productive segment, age-wise, of the population. So this is a real issue.
You don't have to be an altruist. So there's a paper out earlier in 2022 that multiple sclerosis, which wasn't really understood for a long time, in fact, follows from an Epstein-Barr virus infection decades earlier.
Wow.
As Dr.
It's a
Poland was
post-infection.
correct.
Probably.
Probably,
That
but
science isn't
Always
firm.
probably.
Always. But
Probably.
it's a great study, and it's a very strong study. And as Dr. Poland was saying, we had post-viral infectious diseases following the 1918 pandemic.
Yeah.
Right.
We've had something we call MECFS, which is 75% of the victims traced to a viral infection, and then it's a baffling disease. There's a bunch of things. After, for example, there's a randomized trial that shows that if you get the influenza vaccine versus not on people who had already heart disease, the influenza vaccine cut all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality by like an astonishing 2/3.
But even that, that's a really smart way to put it, because one of the problems that we have is some of the side effects of the vaccine mirror the effects of COVID.
Of
So
course.
now you've got this all in the mix, and those who wish to create havoc will look at
Right.
those and say, oh, that wasn't COVID, that was the vaccine.
So,
And
but I'm pitching you, John. We
No,
need
I hear
post-viral
you.
research money
Yes.
because there's all these.
You
not
don't need to
only are
pinch me.
the
I'm with you.
no, but you need to be out there because
Oh,
the thing is,
She's giving you an assignment.
Oh, I didn't
I'm
realize,
giving you an
I didn't realize that was an assignment.
So the thing is, like, there are other like neurological complications. There's a huge rise in, say, Alzheimer diagnoses after
Oh,
both
boy.
influenza and
Okay.
COVID infection. So the post-viral world is potentially the next frontier, and we have in long COVID a large number of people left behind, like the firefighters were left behind.
And so we have to view this as an opportunity to really make some progress.
We need funding, but apparently Congress doesn't allocate funding unless a very talented, super handsome, charming,
What?
wonderful
Give me the name of this fella because I'll go
fella
find him and I'll go make him do
goes
it.
and yells at them
right.
at the galleys
Yeah, they
and
hate that,
brings some
boy.
of his friends along. Do you have the phone number for Julia Roberts, by the way? That I'd
No,
like
I
her
don't.
to.
She's not actually Aaron Brockovich. She's just Julia.
Well, the policy people can't always tell the difference, and so you bring some friends along too.
Understood. Guys, I want to thank you all so much. I know you're awfully busy. This is a conversation that I feel like needs to be had more frequently and more publicly, and I truly do appreciate it. And I know the pressure that all of you are under to get things right, and also from a public that is mistrustful and toxic and all those different things. Dr. Gregory Poland, Dr. Sadomer, Professor Zeynep.
The comments on this video are black
so
pill.
much,
I feel like all
for
of the
being a
comments
part.
on this video are going to revolve around the, oh, you need people to have fear to get vaccines.
Part of the discussion today.
Wonderful.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Woo! Shit, God.
Everything about how this pandemic has been handled is shaping up to be the biggest medical and political scandal of our time. Denmark has halted its vaccine program in April 2022. What? Like Denmark doesn't vaccinate people at all, or?